Resuming debate, the honourable member for Ottawa Carleton. For Carleton.
I want to thank my colleagues for that very rousing welcome, both for the way in which it lifted my spirits, but also for the way in which it permitted me to finish writing my speech. I promise to stop procrastinating, Madam Speaker, just not yet. Today, though, we rise on a very important issue, and that is, of course, the cover-up budget. I will quickly recap how we got to where we are and then discuss how we can get where we need to go. So let's start with a year ago today. The Prime Minister introduced a budget which amended the criminal code in an omnibus bill of over 500 pages, bringing into effect something called deferred prosecution agreements. Such agreements allow corporations accused of serious crime to sign special deals to avoid trial and conviction. It was nowhere discussed in the budget book, but it was slipped into the back end of the budget bill. Members of the Finance Committee, including Liberals, were astonished when they discovered it there at around 10 p.m. in a late-night committee hearing when the government was rushing to get it passed. A year later, we would learn why the government was so determined to introduce this special deal for corporate criminals. It came in the form of a Globe and Mail story revealing that the Prime Minister had inappropriately pressured his Attorney General to extend such a deal to SNC-Lavalin, a large Liberal-linked corporation with a history of donating roughly $100,000 to the Liberal Party illegally. And that company is charged with fraud and bribery. The charges are that they bribed the leaders of Libya in order to steal from the people of Libya. This is not a victimless crime. Sure, the leaders of the Gaddafi family were treated to a cornucopia of gifts from this company, and some might say that is trivial and irrelevant. But the consequence was that the poorest people in the world, among the poorest people in the world, were robbed of $130 million, according to these allegations. These are not victimless crimes. This is not just how it's done over there. We later learned from the Attorney General's testimony before the Justice Committee that the allegations were true. She said that over a 4-month period she experienced consistent and sustained interference, that she was hounded, bullied, experienced veiled threats, and ultimately removed from her job because she refused to interrupt the criminal proceedings and let SNC escape prosecution. Many called her a liar, said she wasn't telling the truth, that she was simply doing it all for publicity or out of some strange vengeance. And then, of course, she released documented evidence and audio tape proving everything she said was true. Members of the government, despite having a massive apparatus of researchers and spin doctors, have not been able to contradict a single solitary fact that she presented before the committee or that she stated anywhere else. Against this backdrop, we see a government that has provided nothing but a cavalcade of contradictions and changing stories. In the last 3 weeks, the Prime Minister has killed 2 parliamentary investigations into this matter and refused to call a public inquiry. This morning, the Justice Committee met to decide whether it would resume its earlier investigation. And a quick glance at the website of the Justice Committee appears to suggest that that under the direction of the Prime Minister, the committee has decided not to proceed with its investigation. Now, where do we go from here?
And the cover-up.
Where do we go from here? To see forward, we have to look backward. Such has been the method of all great advancement. look back at the great advancements in history, and they were made by people who understood history. Think, for example, of Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. We all remember that it ends with government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But that's just the ending of the speech. The beginning starts with history. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. 407 years ago, of course, refers to 87 years of passage of time. So Lincoln was saying to his country that for them to go forward in freedom, a freedom that would involve, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, they needed to look back to 1776 and master their history and live up to the words of their forebears. So here today, as we discuss the ancient principle of judicial independence, we too must look backwards at our history to understand where from these principles originate. To go forward, we have to be able to look backward. Winston Churchill understood this. He was probably the most prescient statesman ever to live. His incredible clairvoyance is unmatched. And we all know the famous example. He, early in the 30s, predicted the comprehensive evil of Adolf Hitler, even when many others saw him as harmless. He called for a robust national defense to prepare for what he foresaw years in advance as Hitler's forthcoming aggression towards world domination. Now, how did he see forward? Well, he looked backwards. He understood history. We all know that he, at Fulton, Missouri, Westminster College in 1946, predicted the beginning of the Cold War. He spoke of an Iron Curtain descending over Europe. 1946, well before the rest of the world was even thinking about conflict with Stalin, who had been a World War II so-called ally. How did he see forward? He was able to look backward. He was able to look backward because he was the author of 58 volumes of Nobel Prize-winning literature, almost all of it on history. But for one or two, in what he admitted were failed attempts to write novels, he wrote almost exclusively about history. And when instructing young people at a commencement ceremony on what they must do to succeed in life, he gave them 3 pieces of advice. Study history, history, and history.
Yeah.
Now, the predictions that he made were not limited to the political realm. A lot of people don't know that in a 1931 Maclean's Magazine essay, 1931, he predicted the iPad. He said, in future years, men and women will be able to hold in their hands a device. And then he predicted Skype. He said they will be able to speak to someone on the other side of the world instantaneously as though they are sticking their head out the window and speaking to a neighbor. He said that these devices would be connected by a central device in a household, which we call routers or modems today. This is 1931. He predicted that humanity would one day unleash the extraordinary power of the atom for good and for evil. Again, this is over a decade before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He predicted the forthcoming conflict between free nations and socialist nations, which of course both manifested themselves in the Second World War, where we fought National Socialism in Germany and Italy, and in the Cold War, where we fought Marxist socialism. But again, he predicted this in 1931, decades before any of these events would actually come to pass. But you know what else he did in that essay, Madam Speaker? He explained his methodology for seeing the future. He actually gave kind of an IKEA instruction manual on how you can become a fortune teller. He said there are two ways to see ahead. Both of them involve looking backwards. One is the cyclical methodology, and that's one you use when you see events in the present that have existed in the past. You look where they ended up in the past, and then you can predict where they will again end in the future. Now, somebody says Gomery, pointing to the Liberal sponsorship scandal, and quite rightly, that history is now repeating itself with the SNC-Lavalin scandal.
So corrupt.
Then he said there was another methodology for seeing the future, and it was the trajectory model. And that is used for when you're trying to anticipate something that has never existed before. And I believe this is how he was able to foretell all of the technological advancements contained in that incredible essay. And he did it, this methodology involves seeing where things are, seeing where things were, where things are, and therefore projecting where they will be. But both of these methods, whether you use a circular view of history repeating itself, or a trajectory to judge where things have been, where they are, to imagine where they will be, involve looking backwards. This methodology makes sense with what we know about neurology. The human mind creates images for its imagination out of fragmented memories of the past. In other words, the things that we imagine in the future are the things that we have stored away in our memory from the past. And thus was he capable of taking that 58 volumes of literature that he had written, and the millions of words that he had read, and the countless historic events of which he had been a part, and was able, therefore, to take that knowledge and project it forward deep, deep into the future, seeing far beyond what anyone else could see. So that is, I say all of this, Madam Speaker, as a justification for delving deep into our own history in order to judge how we might proceed with this present-day controversy. Some members might be tempted to jump up on points of order as I look back at where our democracy came from and ask me the relevance, ask you to rule that I no longer be permitted to speak about our past because the past, according to some, no longer matters. But of course, I make these earlier remarks to tell you how very much our past matters and how much it can tell us about our future. This is a lesson that our current Prime Minister should learn. In his speech before the House of Commons some time ago, marking a great anniversary of the Parliament of Canada, he basically omitted the entire history of the Westminster system. Yes. And spoke of Parliament as though freedom and democracy were just invented by his dad in 1982. But of course, we know that that kind of thinking is dangerous. Our history, we today stand on the shoulders of giants, that we here inherit something great from those who came before us, and that we must always remember, especially in the debate about the interference of political actors in our judicial system, that while our parliamentary civilization may be 800 years long, it is only 1 or 2 generations deep. In other words, if 1 or 2 generations decide to dispense with its hard and fast rules and replace them with some new modern invention rooted in nothing but symbolism, selfies, and sobbing speeches, then we very much will be living in a house resting on sand, Madam Speaker. Now, speaking of sand and sandstone, I see a lot of it all around us here today. We are inside the courtyard of the former West Block building, a building whose exterior has always been clad with sandstone. That, of course, because sandstone tends to be more resistant to the weathering effects of our brutal Canadian climate. Now, that being said, we used to meet in another place called Centre Block. And in Centre Block, when you're inside the building, you actually bear witness to a different stone, limestone. Limestone from Manitoba, someone very patriotically yells out from across the way. And he should take great pride in that limestone. It is literally part of Canada. It is exhumed from the ground and builds up the democratic institutions that we now enjoy in Canada's parliamentary system. And while you walk around that old Centre Block building, you might see a number of different substances. You might have seen before we moved the white oak desks that we have here, solid as oak. You might go into the library and see the beautifully ornate and well-carved pine, polished brilliantly, resplendent before the eyes of every astonished visitor. You might look up at the gilded dome, and there you would see gold looking back down at you. You might look down at the ground and see the cherry, oak, and walnut wood on which our feet walk. And all of those elements are beautiful. But for me, what matters most is the stone, the limestone. The limestone takes us back in time. As you walked into the basement of the House of Commons building, the Centre Block building, you could walk millions of years into history. Inside those stones are fragments, skeletal fragments of marine life, compressed and piled millions of times under unimaginable, nearly infinite pressure to create this stone. You can literally witness seashells in the walls, staring right back at you. Those seashells would have been sliced in half by a stonemason in the 19th century, or perhaps in the early 20th century as Parliament was rebuilt following the World War I era fire. But either way, though in those stones is the story of time. And there are two parts to that story. The first part is that limestone is solid and, to our eyes, unmoving. A perfect symbol of the institution that that stone is used to build up. And it should be so. But also in that same stone is evidence that nature, all nature, including geological nature, including the rocks and stones we see as indestructible, are always in transformation, that they always risk erosion, that one object today was a different object long ago, and that we must always work every day to preserve what we have so that that stone may never erode, that these oak desks may never be nibbled away by termites, and that the institutions that took so long for us to build up shall never be allowed to disintegrate piece by piece. And that is why this debate is so important. Changes, the disintegration of great civilizations don't just happen with a sudden bang. You know, they say Rome wasn't built in a day, and that's true. But it wasn't destroyed in a day either. It took almost half a millennia from the time Julius Caesar converted the Roman Republic into an empire, and himself from consul into an emperor, until the Roman Empire disintegrated and was sacked and defeated. So, an early decision can slowly eat away and wear down the once mighty and apparently indestructible institutions that give rise to the people in the first place. Thus, we must be so vigilant and on guard whenever they come under attack. And the former Attorney General has said that our core institutions faced such an attack from the Prime Minister of Canada. She testified that he personally and politically tried to interfere with a criminal prosecution. Our institutional history is one that separates court from Parliament, judge from Prime Minister, and deliberately so. We understand that as soon as the politicians start to mess with the courtroom, then we will go from the rule of law to the law of rulers. And this history is encapsulated in stone. And I have here a beautiful book, which I'm not allowed to hold up because of parliamentary rules, by Eleanor Milne, Captured in Stone, Carving Canada's Past. And if you walk through the old center block building, there you will find beautiful carvings chiseled in the wall that tell us of where we came from. I quote, "East Wall, Set 1, the first inhabitants of the North American continent. In the Bluefish Caves of northern Yukon, archaeologists have found evidence of the use of stone tools between 2,500 and 12,000 years ago. And the images of that life is carved in the wall with Inuit people carrying out their hunting traditions. You can go forward, the native people who greeted the Vikings in the year 900 and 1000. And then, of course, we have images in the center stone of John Cabot holding up a scroll in his left hand and a tiller in his right. We have, of course, elsewhere, the first merchant ships to navigate the St. Lawrence River on the center stone. We have Samuel de Champlain, the founder of Quebec City, when he encountered an Aboriginal guide willing to lead him inland. We turn forward and we see that on the left panel, the first colonies of 1763, and on the center stone, a family of European settlers establishing a homestead. We see also carved in the wall the great surveyor, David Thompson, interacting with our Indigenous people. And finally, on the north wall, Set 3, the long road to freedom and justice is engraved there, Madam Speaker. And all Canadians who have not seen it should make haste to do so when the center block reopens. And there is described, as I quote from this great book, "A strong figure is breaking chains, freeing doves. This speaks a symbolic language stating that those who come to this land to begin anew must leave all rage and bias behind." Now, why do so many people come to this land? And why are they so successful when they get here? Why is it that so many peoples of the world live in such squalor over there, and yet when they come here, the very same people they enjoy such prosperity over here. We can't say that it's anything unique about our makeup as a species. We're just the same as the rest of the world. In fact, we are the peoples of the world, literally. We are a reflection of the world because of our long-standing and successful tradition of high levels of immigration.
Point of order. Point of order, Madam Speaker. Our honourable colleague is...
I'm sorry, the member's not in his seat, and therefore I can't recognize him. The honourable member of Carleton.
That long history that brings us to this moment tells us why so many people from so many far-off lands make the journey here, and why it is that they're so successful here when their lives were so much poorer elsewhere. So what is it that makes life so different here than it was over there? Is there something in the water? Is the air different? Why are we as a nation so prosperous when so many others suffer so greatly? Well, I look to the great Wilfrid Laurier for the answer. He was once asked to comment on Canada's nationality. And even then, it was a seemingly impossible task. If he were in France, he would say French. If he were in England, he would say English. If he were in Scotland, he would say Scottish. But of course, here in Canada, by his time at the beginning of the 20th century, we were all those things and much more. He could not define us by ethnicity, by language, by religion. In fact, he himself, though a French Catholic, read the King James Bible and therefore was probably even able to make his own identity known based on religion. So how is it that he identified the Canadian nationality? He did so in these simple words: Canada is free, and freedom is its nationality. Canada is free, and freedom is its nationality.
Amen.
From whence did that freedom come, though? That was the next question he needed to answer. Now, of course, he was a proud French Canadian who mixed very easily with people of other backgrounds. He said famously that when he was speaking about his time in school, he said, I had schoolyard fights with the Scottish boys and made schoolboy love with the Scottish girls. In other words, he grew up with Scottish kids even though he was French through and through. And his identity of Canadian freedom was actually British, even though his lineage was French. He said this other quote that I'll never forget of French Canadians: France gave us life, and Britain gave us liberty. I say that to explain that the inheritance of British parliamentary democracy, of the House of Commons, of common law, and of so many other principles of British history, that they are the inheritance of all people who live in this land, not just those who have an ethnic lineage back to Britain. In other words, we all inherit it. Even though I'm not English, I inherit these English liberties just the way Laurier said that he did too. And what are these English liberties and how did they originate? Well, they started with the Magna Carta in 1215. May of 1215, the angry barons gathered in the fields of Runnymede. They were taxed to the max after years of crusading kings pillaging and plundered. They were tired of the crown's tyranny, and they were determined to reverse it. And they forced King John, against his will, to sit and sign the Great Charter, or Magna Carta, as it is called. Now, as you look through the Magna Carta's roughly 60 clauses, you might find them a little bit arcane. There's talk of scutage and fish weirs and other arcana that might not seem relevant in the present. But there's a whole lot more that is. You think of let me read some of the excerpts from that great document. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will he proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals and by the law of the land. What does that mean? No arrest without charge, no conviction without trial. I think that's pretty relevant today, isn't it? Let me try another one. He shall do this without destruction or damage to men or property. If we have given the guardianship of the land to a sheriff or to any person answerable to us for the revenues, he commits destruction or damage, we will exact compensation from him. Many important things here. One, if we have given the guardianship of the land to a sheriff. In other words, only a civil authority approved with a democratic mandate must have the ability to arrest or do damage to property, and in that case, there must be compensation if such damage or such arrest was not justified. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals and by the law of the land. That, of course, does not only speak to arrest, but property rights. And to this day, we state clearly that the Crown may not dispossess someone of his or her belongings absent compensation for doing so or without lawful judgment of equals or by the law of the land. In other words, arbitrary expropriation is forbidden. And then let me just once again pull another incredible invention out of that same statement. Except by the lawful judgment of his equals. In other words, jury trials have their origins right here in this sacred text. So don't tell me that these old parchments are a relic of the past and we should forget about them and Canada was invented in 1982. These are ancient English liberties that are our inheritance and no one can take them away. Here's one that's particularly relevant to this debate. I hope the Prime Minister's listening to this. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. I look first at that starting clause. To no one will we sell. It doesn't matter how many billions are in SNC-Lavalin coffers, how many lobbyists it can send scurrying about Parliament Hill, how many illegal donations it can make to political parties, how many prospective job offers it can throw around, no matter how much it flexes its financial muscle, we will not sell them justice. Justice is not for sale.
Hear, hear.
It goes on. To any man whom we might have deprived or dispossessed of lands, castles, liberties, or rights without the lawful judgment of his equals, we will at once restore these. In other words, the Crown must compensate for what the Crown has taken away. All of these customs and liberties that we have granted shall be observed in our kingdom insofar as concerns our own relations with our subjects. Let all men of our kingdom, whether clergy or laymen, observe them similarly in their relations with their own men. In other words, clergy and laymen alike, Crown or subject, all must follow the law. And then I bring your attention, of course, to the most important of all. To all free men of our kingdom, we have also granted for us and our heirs forever all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and their heirs, for us and our heirs. Madam Speaker, we are those heirs. We have inherited this. These are our liberties. They belong to us. And the people of our country, the common people, have delegated us to this chamber to protect those liberties. Thus, the ferocious response from the Canadian people that has surprised so many political observers to the scandal that currently rages inside this government. You know, a lot of people have said, why is it that people are so upset? It is a debate over text messages and emails and he said and she said and prosecutorial independence. How often do you hear that discussed at the water coolers of the workplace in Canada? Why is it that Canadians have resounded so strongly to this particular scandal? Well, the answer is because this scandal is not that complicated. It's actually quite simple. It is based on one simple rule that everyone understands from childhood in Canada, and it is this: we are all equal before the law. And this, too, had its imperfect origins in the Magna Carta. Because at the moment that King John signed that parchment, he conceded, for the first time in the known history of our system, that he, as the king, was no longer above the law. At that moment, Crown became subject to the law, and no one, not even the king, was above the law. Everybody understands that we're all equal before the law. And that if a homeless man is charged with stealing a loaf of bread, he can't simply knock on the Prime Minister's door and say, please make the prosecutor go light on me, sir. He faces a trial, either by a judge or a jury, and a verdict is rendered based on the facts, the precedents, and the law. And if it must be so for a homeless man charged with taking a loaf of bread, it sure as hell must be so for a powerful international corporation charged with corruption. People understand that money already has too much influence in most Western democracies. We don't need it to have more influence in the judicial system. We don't want two legal systems, one for the people and another for the powerful. We don't want justice to be for sale. We don't want the politicians to tell the judges or the prosecutors what they can and should do. That is a basic principle dating back. Now, one of the reasons why, you look at the British North American Act, and you know what I notice when I read it, Madam Speaker? That there's none of the soaring language that you witness in the Declaration of Independence or even in the U.S. Constitution. There was no Thomas Jefferson who sat down with feather and drafted up words that we all remember or that we etch or repeat other than peace, order, and good government. And why was that? And the answer, of course, is that we understood, our founding fathers understood, that they didn't need to write out all of our freedoms at that moment in time because it was accepted that we would inherit those that came from the Mother Parliament. and from the Magna Carta. Now, it has been a positive development, I will say, that we have since written them out in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But that charter was merely a continuation of a then 7.5 century tradition that came before it. It was a continuation of the Bill of Rights brought before Parliament by John Diefenbaker. But it was a continuation of everything that began in that field at Runnymede so long ago. And we are a nation not of revolution, but of evolution, where our friends south of the border spilled much blood to achieve their independence. We as a country almost had to be gently pushed out the door by the mother country. Of course, back in the early 30s with the Statute of Westminster, we were given full judicial independence, and yet for decades we would continue to go back to the British Privy Council as our Supreme Court. In other words, they were offering Canada more independence than we were prepared to accept.
Madam Chair, point of order.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands has a point of order.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt my colleague. I just wanted to make a point of order. A little bit earlier, we had the chair of the Agriculture Committee in here and talk about a correction to a report that he wanted to make. And I guess I wanted to make the point that if he had really been doing his job as he should have been doing, he would have come here on a different issue, and that is to bring forward the proposal and to support the proposal that one of our colleagues has made now twice, that we have an emergency debate on the canola issue. And it's, Madam Speaker, this is an incredibly important issue for Canadians, and I want to challenge the chair of the Ag Committee that he needs to come back and take up that cause. There are 43,000 canola farmers across Canada. This has been one of the most prominent success stories in agriculture across Canada in the last decades. From the 1970s, we have seen an industry develop basically out of nothing that is now sets around $27 billion of economic activity in this country every year. And so
Unfortunately, it's not a point of order, and what the member did previously is something that is normal to do when they want to bring corrections over, and what the honourable member is doing right now is a point of debate, and therefore, unless he has a motion that he's putting forward as part of his point of order, I am going to go back to the honourable member for Carleton. The honourable, so I just want to make sure that the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands did not have a motion. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grassland?
Yeah, I'm waiting for. Oh, I don't at this point, but I certainly reserve the opportunity to do that a little bit later. But I'd like to hear my colleague's point of order on the other side, and perhaps pertains to this, because I think it's incredibly important.
That's fine. I will go to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, to the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Madam Speaker. And just so that members across the way are aware, that the reality is that we are under budget debate, which provides 12 members every hour the opportunity to be able to stand up and address the budget. The canola issue is of critical importance. I myself am from the prairies. There's many lost opportunities by the tactic the Conservatives have taken on the issue.
What the honourable member is bringing forward is a debate as well, and I would hope that he would wait until questions and comments opportunity comes along. I'm sure it will at some point, and to be able to speak to that. I do want to ride the member for Carleton that we are speaking on the budget, and I'm assuming that he will ensure that his speech, although there's a lot of latitude there, will relate to the question, the issue that is before the House at this point.
Yes, Madam Speaker, and I will first say that the point of order raised by my friend from Saskatchewan illustrates the entire thesis of my speech, that we here are a house of common people. We speak on behalf of the commoners, and the first commoners met in fields. That's why this place is green. And so we should always remember the plight of our farmers in this place, especially now when they are facing an unprecedented attack by a foreign tariff regime against our canola producers the thousands and thousands of them who generate billions of dollars of wealth for and to pay for our schools, our hospitals, and the livelihoods of their people. And when I hear a member from Saskatchewan rise on the floor of the House of Commons, it reminds me why we have Parliament in the first place. It is precisely so that such grievances can and should be raised. And I thank him for his point of order, and I do not resent one iota his interruption of my remarks to make it. Now, returning to the point of my speech, now that I have laid the historical foundations for our entire system, for all the prosperity we enjoy, for the great country in which we live and by which we have been blessed, allow me to settle today's controversy on that foundation. We have before us serious allegations against the Prime Minister. These allegations are that he attempted to politicize a criminal court proceeding. Now, this is not just any criminal court proceeding. This is a case involving formal police allegations of fraud and bribery in amounts that exceed $130 million. It is alleged by the police that this corporation gave millions of dollars of bribes to the Gaddafi family and stole hundreds of millions of dollars from the Libyan people. To quickly recount the allegations with which the company is faced, it is alleged the company that SNC-Lavalin created a shell company, and through that shell company funneled gifts such as yachts and prostitutes to the Gaddafi family, and that these gifts were used to leverage contracts that SNC would not otherwise have won. It is further alleged that public agencies were defrauded by SNC-Lavalin of $130 million. Again, I state, this is not a victimless crime. Many people have said, don't worry, that's just how things are done over there. That is a, frankly, appalling and racist mentality. To suggest that it is acceptable for corporations to get rich by stealing from the world's poor, stealing, not doing business with, stealing from the world's poor, is an appalling suggestion indeed. Many of these countries find people in squalor. Why? They have the same talents and the same work ethic as we do. Why are they so poor? The answer is because of corrupt leadership, parasitical corruption that daily drains away the wealth of the nation, that takes from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned, and puts it in the hands of those who are more powerful and more capable of trampling on the rights of others. We've signed international conventions to ban Canadian corporations, to ensure that Canadian corporations are never to engage in such corruption. And the importance of those conventions is this. For the longest time, businesses thought they could go in and pillage countries like Libya and then leave before any of the local authorities, if there were any honest ones, could prosecute. And they'd return back to their wealthy Western country with their wealthy Western lives and partake in the fruits of their crimes with impunity. But we signed on to international conventions which ban companies from doing that and make sure that they get prosecuted at home. Well, Canada is SNC's home, so that prosecution must happen here. When news that the Prime Minister had attempted to interfere politically with his Attorney General to shelve the criminal prosecution reached the OECD, officials with that body took the nearly unprecedented step of putting out a statement of concern. The OECD understood that if member nations are going to start to exempt their corporations from justice in cases of corruption, then we will return to the old days when it was seen as and believed to be wrongly acceptable for companies to rob the poor. The only way to stop the hideous practice is to make sure all countries of the OECD have an independent prosecution of those crimes. Now, it is true that some other countries around the world have deferred prosecution agreements, like the one the government instituted in its budget bill. However, those agreements are to be negotiated and potentially arrived at by independent prosecutors approved by a judge, not directed by a political authority. In other words, it is the job of the Director of Public Prosecutions, an independent prosecutor created by Stephen Harper's Accountability Act, to examine the deferred prosecution rules in the criminal code and determine if a company qualifies. Now, what are the criteria that they're supposed to take into consideration when they do? 1, is it a severe offense? Well, let's ask. Is it a severe offense, or was it a small hiccup? As I've already said, the allegation is of over $130 million of fraud. That is severe. In other words, the company does not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement on the basis that the offense was not severe. It was severe. 2, was it an isolated incident? Well, let's just recount the track record. This is a company that has been implicated in and found, and in some cases its employees found guilty of, bribery in the bid on the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal. It is a company that has been, for which the CEO was found guilty of participating in bribery in the McGill Health Center contract. It is a company that helped members of the Gaddafi family smuggle members of the Gaddafi family out of Mexico in order to avoid justice. It's a company whose members have been charged in places as diverse as Panama, Switzerland, Libya, Mexico, and now Canada. Now that is just the charges, Madam Speaker. There have been many convictions and many guilty pleas by members of the company from right up to the top, including the former CEO, Pierre Poilievre. Guilty verdict in his case, where he actually pled guilty, for fraud. In fact, this company engaged in a kickback scheme designed to pump $100,000 of illegal donations into the Liberal Party. The Commissioner of Canada Elections, in an extreme act of leniency, allowed the company to avoid charges in exchange for signing a compliance agreement in this case. And in that compliance agreement, the company admits that executives urged employees to produce phony expenses and invoices and gave phony bonuses to those same employees, and then instructed those employees.
Point of order. Madam Speaker,
I'm sorry, the member's still not in his seat. That's the second time I let him know that in order to raise a point of order, he has to be in this seat. The honourable member for Carleton.
And then the company executives told the company employees that they should take these phony bonuses and expense refunds and give them to the Liberal Party of Canada.
The honourable member for Cariboo Prince George has a point of order.
I would suggest that we've lost quorum.
I would just ask the member from Carleton just to sit down for a second, and we're just going to check something here. We do have quorum in the House at this point, so the honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I was just saying, just as I was saying that the Liberal Party had received these illegal donations from SNC-Lavalin, all of these members came scurrying in. They heard the word donation, and all of a sudden they were very excited. And the House went from completely empty to chock full. It was sorry. I'm sorry to dangle that carrot in front of my Liberal friends. They can resist everything except temptation, for sure, Madam Speaker. Of course, just last week, the Prime Minister was at a glitzy Liberal fundraiser where some First Nations protesters rose to raise the concern of mercury poisoning, and he chuckled at their plight and had them thrown out aggressively by security, but he was kind enough to thank them for their donation as they went out the door. To great roars of laughter from the $1,500 Liberal donors and glitterati who looked on in the audience. But I have now digressed. Back to the subject at hand. This was SNC's alleged fraud in Libya an isolated incident? No, it was not. It is part of a long-standing pattern of proven and corruption that has been upheld by judges and has resulted in convictions in years going back 20 years to the present, convictions being issued as recently as 1.5 years ago. This is a company that had actually developed a coding system to account for bribery within the company. They created their own accounting code so that they could go on bribing officials and account for it in a way that neither the tax authorities or anyone else would know was going on. Now, to do that, to have a special coding system, you have to be systematically focused on the objective of bribing and defrauding other people. So in other words, this wasn't just a few bad apples that went off to Libya and did some inappropriate things, and we ought to just let them take the fall and the company move on. This is systematic, rotten corruption that goes to the core of the company and has been prevalent in its right to the heart of it, of that enterprise, for many, many years. And so, in other words, the company does not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement on the grounds that it was an isolated incident. Far from it, it seemed to be a modus operandi. And in other words, the Director of Public Prosecutions carefully analyzed the facts that the company put forward and determined through those facts that the deferred prosecution agreement provided for in law was not appropriate in this case. End of story, right? Wrong.
Wrong.
Wrong. Not end of story. For the Prime Minister, it was the beginning of the story.
Which story?
The story is a very ugly and sordid tale, but one that we have started to hear over the last 2 months. At that point in time, September 4th, 2018, the Director of Public Prosecutions accurately and properly concludes SNC-Lavalin should go to trial and face the music for its alleged $130 million of bribery and corruption, and says so in a letter to the executives, a letter that the company will not go on to reveal for another over more than a month, during which time its shareholders were kept in the dark. Sounds like a lot has changed over there. But the company didn't take no for an answer. Lobbyists swarmed to Parliament Hill. The lobbyist registry shows meetings between SNC officials and top-level personnel in the Prime Minister's office and in the finance minister's office. In fact, the finance minister himself met with the company approximately 10 days after the director of public prosecutions rendered her decision to ensure the trial would go ahead. And after that extraordinary act of lobbying, in those 10 days that followed the prosecutor's decision, well, the political heat started to rise. The Attorney General started to face veiled threats, hounding, pressure, interference. By the way, all of those words I've just used were quoted from her mouth. She experienced it in a September 18th meeting with the Prime Minister, where he attempted to strong-arm her into granting a deferred prosecution agreement and shelving the charges. She said, "I looked him in the eye."
Yep.
And I said, "Are you interfering with my job as Attorney General?" Because I strongly advise against it. I strongly advise against it, she said, as she looked him in the eye. So much for his subsequent claim that she never once raised a concern about his personal political interference. But that meeting would only be the beginning. A cavalcade of pressure would come marching through her office again and again and again. It was the chief of staff to the finance minister would reach out in emails and text messages. Other senior staff in the Prime Minister's office, including his senior advisor, the principal secretary, and the chief of staff, would all go and meet personally with top-level staff members of the Attorney General, constantly twisting their arms. They said things like, "We don't want to hear any more about legalities. There's no solution that doesn't involve political interference." I'm not paraphrasing. This is what they said. It's in the notes. Those notes were transmitted by text message to the Attorney General and have since been tabled with the Justice Committee and made available for all eyes to see. And then we had that incredible meeting by phone between the Attorney General and the clerk of the Privy Council, in which the clerk had said he wanted to talk to her about the SNC-Lavalin issue. And that conversation went on for 17 minutes, during which more than a dozen times, the clerk of the Privy Council attempted to change the Attorney General's mind. He used terms like, "The Prime Minister is very firm." He used the word firm 4 times. He used the words, the clerk of the Privy Council indicated that the Prime Minister was in one of those moods.
Oh, we know those. What kind of mood is that?
And he said that the Prime Minister would find a way to get it done one way or another. Now, the only way he could get it done, the only way he could get such an agreement imposed on the prosecutor is if he removed his Attorney General. And then, more ominously, the clerk said he was worried. Worried about what? Asked the Attorney General. "I'm worried that because it's never good for the Attorney General and the Prime Minister to be at loggerheads."
It's a threat.
And then he said, he warned of, quote, "a collision." His words, "a collision between the Attorney General and her boss, the Prime Minister." Somebody warns you that you're about to have a collision with your boss if you don't do what you're told. What does that mean to you? What would you later interpret it to mean if that same boss moved you out of your job only weeks later? Would you think that collision and that removal from your job were two totally unrelated events? Or would you conclude, as the Attorney General did, and most of the rest of the country has, that the Prime Minister removed her because she refused to do his bidding and stop the trial into SNC-Lavalin? You know what's interesting about the Attorney General's account? It's never changed. She came before a committee, testified at great length, faced aggressive questioning from Liberal members on the committee. An aggressive group of supporters, Prime Minister's supporters in the press, have attempted to discredit her. They tried to poke holes in everything she said. But you know what? They can't find anything. She did the unprecedented thing on Friday. She handed over 40 pages of text messages, personal notes, diary entries, and of course, audio recordings.
Proof.
And you know what the opposition, the Liberals said in response? There's nothing new here. And you know what? They're right. There was nothing new there. You know why? Because her story hadn't changed. It upheld every claim she had made. There wasn't a single solitary contradiction they could find. In courtrooms, judges, or in investigations, police, when they have to choose between the credibility of two competing individuals, always gravitate towards the one whose story doesn't change. And that one is the Attorney General. The Prime Minister, by contrast, his story changes faster than his colorful socks. He's always got a new story. Let me give you one twist and turn in this whole drama. He says, and I'm quoting, "If anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward. And no one did." And no one did. And yet, we have that incredible recording wherein the Attorney General says, and I quote, this is 2 months before the Prime Minister made that statement that no one came forward. She says to his own clerk, "So we are treading on dangerous ground here, and I am going to issue my stern warning, because I cannot act in a manner, and the prosecution cannot act in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I cannot act in a partisan way, and I cannot be politically motivated. This all screams of that," end quote. So much for no one came forward. That was one of 7 times in that 17-minute conversation where she made similar comments. She said, "This is inappropriate. I feel uncomfortable. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. This reminds me of the Saturday Night Massacre, a reference to Richard Nixon's firing of Justice Department officials to cover up Watergate. And no one raised any concerns? Right. Since then, the Prime Minister's story has been, oh, well, I suppose that conversation did happen, but no one told me. I left on vacation right after the call was done, so no one had a chance. I was gone."
Yeah, sure. Okay.
The only problem with that story is that he didn't. He did not leave on vacation right after the call was done.
Oh.
After that story came out, a few intrepid journalists looked at the publicly available schedule of the Prime Minister and found that he did not leave for vacation for another 2 days.
Ruh-roh.
2 days is not a long, is a heck of a long time. And it's very easy to brief someone on a 17-minute conversation in a 2-hour period. But the Prime Minister would have us believe that he couldn't be briefed because he was busy packing for his vacation for 2 days.
Lots of socks,
Lots
man.
of socks he had to pack
What?
in order to prepare for that vacation. So for 2 days, he was hunkered down in his closet at home at his government-owned mansion, preparing for that exhausting vacation ahead, packing his bags so that he could go off and surf in Tofino, never to be distracted by a pesky phone call from his top public servant about an issue that the Prime Minister had considered of intense importance only hours before the call happened. And furthermore, we have the testimony from the clerk who said, when he was admonishing the Attorney General for not reaching out to the Prime Minister personally, said he is available 24/7. So if he's available 24/7, how is it possible that the clerk of the Privy Council would have no opportunity between December 19th and February 15th, a 2-month period, to tell the Prime Minister about this exceptional and explosive phone call he had had with the Attorney General on this issue of dramatic importance? Well, that is just one contradiction in that particular claim. But the other, of course, is that the Attorney General met with the Prime Minister on September 18th and told him of her concerns. She looked him in the eye at that time. So we have one documented example of where she raised her concerns with him personally. We have the second tape-recorded example of where she raised her concerns with his clerk of the Privy Council. And then we have a dramatic meeting between the Attorney General and the Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, Gerald Butts, the puppet master of the PMO, in which she there raised concerns about the inappropriate interference of the Prime Minister's office in the case. But somehow the Prime Minister expects us to believe that he knew absolutely nothing about her concerns or about her decision not to grant a special deal to this company. Madam Speaker, that is simply not believable. But if it is truly the Prime Minister's position, and if he really believes he can defend it, then he can agree with our singular demand today, which is to reopen the Justice Committee investigation.
Hear, hear.
Invite roughly a dozen witnesses, including those in the Prime Minister accused of interfering with the criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. If they've got nothing to hide, if he's got nothing to hide, he will let them all appear under oath without restriction to answer questions. And if he walks into this place and offers to do that, I will end my speech now.
No, more.
No.
More.
You applauded a little bit too quickly there. I'll try not to be offended. But in all seriousness, if the Prime Minister were to stand in his seat and make the commitment that the Justice Committee investigation will reopen, then he has my commitment to return to my chair and allow the debate to continue with other speakers so that Canadians can get to the truth. And if he has nothing to hide, why wouldn't he do it?
Why wouldn't he come to question?
What would be the harm in having the questions? If he says there's nothing to learn, we've already learned everything we have. Okay, well, then it will be just a redundant exercise. I suppose that would be the first time in the history of Parliament that anything redundant ever happened, that anyone repeated themselves. I think I've done it a few times in my speech, but no one noticed. So, what harm would it do if the Prime Minister has nothing to hide? To bring people before the committee, ask them questions about their role in the scandal, and get the answers in a report from the committee before the election. If the Prime Minister truly has nothing to hide, then that is exactly what he will do. Now, it's been brought to my attention, Madam Chair, that the Prime Minister not only is going to shut down the Justice Committee and Ethics Committee investigations into this scandal, but that he is now bailed on question period for today. I understand, and I have not been able to independently confirm it, but I am under the understanding from a note just passed